The worst part was not the cold. It was the silence. The particular kind of silence that settles over a place after something irreversible has already happened, and the world simply hasn't bothered to tell you yet. Millie pressed her back against the exterior wall of the great hall, her fingers numb inside her woolen gloves, her breath rising in pale threads that dissolved into the gray morning air. Snow had fallen through the night, thick and indifferent, and it blanketed the stone courtyard of Ashvale Pack in a way that made everything look clean. Unbothered, like nothing underneath it was rotting. She had been standing there for nearly an hour. She knew, because she had counted the bells from the chapel tower, 2 of them, low and unhurried, and still she could not make herself move away from the wall or toward the door. Her feet had gone past cold and into something closer to wood. Her gray wool cloak, the one her mother had stitched for her the winter before she died, had soaked through at the shoulders where the snow came sideways off the eaves. She should have gone inside. She didn't, because inside was where she would have to hear it said aloud. The voices had reached her here. Through the gap in the shutter, she'd noticed 3 days ago and never mentioned to anyone. She had been passing that first time, carrying a tray of herbs for the healer's stores, and she'd heard her name spoken in the tone that people use when they believe they are alone. She'd stopped. She hadn't meant to listen. But the body, sometimes, is smarter than pride. The Omega girl, Millie, she'll need to be gone before the first thaw. Her stepbrother Corvin's voice. She had recognized it the way you recognize the smell of something that has been wrong for a long time, but that you kept telling yourself was fine. And if she refuses? That was Sella, Corvin's mate. Her voice was always pleasant, the way the surface of still water is pleasant. Right before you notice there's nothing living underneath it. She won't. She has nowhere to go. I've already sent word to Lord Fenwick that her portion of the estate is contested. By the time his council reviews it, the deed will carry only my name. A pause. The fire crackling somewhere inside. Then Sella again, quieter. And if she goes to the Alphaking's border posts, she could claim sanctuary, an Omega without a pack. Let her try. She has no wolf, no rank, no proof of lineage that isn't tied to documentation I now control. She'll freeze in a ditch before anyone with authority believes a word she says. That had been 3 days ago. Millie had spent those 3 days being careful. She had eaten at the common table with everyone else. She had helped the healer sort dried rosemary and chamomile into linen pouches. She had smiled when spoken to, and said little, and watched Corvin's eyes follow her with the patient satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. And last night, while the first true blizzard of the season began to build beyond the mountains, she had gone to the records room. The documents were gone. Every deed her father had signed before his death. Every letter of inheritance. The small leather folio with the lunar pack seal that marked her as a daughter of Ashvale blood. Gone. The shelf was bare. Dust marked exactly where they had sat for 11 years. She had stood there for a long time, one candle in her hand, watching the flame not move. Then she had gone to her room, taken the gray cloak from its hook, the leather satchel from under the bed, and packed with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that grief is a thing for later. Now, in the courtyard, in the snow, she made herself step away from the wall. She had no wolf. That was the truth Corvin had spoken, and it was the one that would hurt her most in the days ahead. Omegas without inner wolves existed. Rare, considered a mark of weakness, regarded by most packs the way a cracked beam is regarded in a house, noted, worked around, quietly waited upon to fail. Her wolf had simply never surfaced. Not at 16, not at 18, not at 22, which was her age now. The healers had given up explaining it. Her father had never mentioned it again after the first year, though he'd looked at her differently from then on, not cruelly, just with the particular sadness of a man recalibrating. She had learned to live in a world built for shifters without becoming one. She knew which herbs dulled a dominant's aggression. She knew how to move in rooms full of ranked wolves without triggering threat responses. She knew how to be invisible in plain sight, which was, she had come to understand, its own form of survival. The gate at the eastern edge of the courtyard was unguarded this early. The night watch had just rotated, and there was a 10-minute window between the old guard leaving and the new one arriving that Millie had observed and memorized over 2 careful mornings of watching from her window. She walked through it without running. Running, she knew, would draw attention. Running was what prey did. She walked steadily, her boots finding purchase in the new snow, her satchel across one shoulder, her braid tucked beneath the hood of her cloak. The forest beyond the eastern gate was dark and dense, pine and oak standing shoulder to shoulder like sentinels that had long since decided to ignore the affairs of the pack behind them. The cold here was a different kind of cold. Alive, moving, smelling of resin and ice and the particular mineral sharpness of stone in winter. Millie pulled her cloak tighter and kept moving. She had a direction. That was all she had. 3 weeks passed, a traveling wool merchant, one of the human traders who moved between pack territories with careful neutrality, had mentioned, while she'd helped him stable his horse, that the northernmost outpost of the Ironvale Kingdom sat 4 days' walk from Ashvale's eastern border. The Alphaking's territory. Xander of Ironvale, he was called, though most people simply said the king and left it at that, in the tone people use when a name alone is enough to make a room go quiet. She did not know what she would find there. She did not know if an Omega without a wolf and without papers would be received or turned away or handed back to the pack she'd left. She did not know if Corvin had already sent riders ahead to poison the ground before she arrived. What she knew was this: the alternative was to go back. And she had seen, in the bare shelf where her father's documents used to be, exactly what going back meant. The snow began falling again around mid-morning, steady, purposeful, the kind that doesn't ask permission. The trees gave some shelter, but the wind found every gap in her cloak, and by the time the light shifted from gray to the particular amber gray of a heavy afternoon sky, Millie's feet were no longer painful. They had gone past pain. That was when she heard the structure. Not a sound exactly, a shape against the white. The sharp corner of a roofline where nature didn't make corners. A cabin, half sunk into the hillside, nearly invisible under its burden of snow. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of recent passage in the drifts around the door. She pushed the door open. Inside, cold, but sheltered. A stone hearth, a stack of split wood beside it, a rough-hewn table, 2 stools, a cot frame against the far wall with a folded woolen blanket on it. The smell of old ash and pine resin and something else. Something she couldn't name. Something deep and dark and wild that didn't belong to the cold or the wood or the stillness. She was too exhausted to think about what it meant. She built the fire badly at first, her fingers refusing to cooperate. But she had helped the healer long enough to know how to coax a flame from reluctant tinder. When the fire finally caught, she sat down on the stone hearth apron and pressed her hands toward it and let herself shake. Outside, the blizzard arrived. Not the polite, early snowfall of the morning. The real thing. The sound of it was immense. A deep, sustained roar that made the cabin walls shudder and press snow against the single shuttered window until the frame groaned. The fire she'd lit was the only reason the temperature inside didn't plummet. Millie pulled the folded blanket from the cot, wrapped it around herself, and fed the fire carefully, methodically, the way you do when you understand that the fire is the only thing standing between you and the end of everything. She did not let herself think about Corvin. She did not let herself think about the empty shelf, or her father's seal, or the expression on Sella's face in the moments when Sella forgot to keep it pleasant. She thought about wood, about the size of the remaining stack, about how long a fire this size would need to eat through each piece, and how many pieces there were, and how long the storm might last. That was how she fell asleep, calculating survival, one log at a time. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the boots on the stone floor, or the pause that followed, long and still and weighted with something she would only understand later. She did not hear the low sound that came from somewhere in the chest of whoever stood in the doorway, looking at the fire she had built in his hearth, and the girl sleeping beside it wrapped in his blanket. She heard none of it. But somewhere beneath sleep, in the part of her that had survived by staying alert, even when the rest of her had given up, something noticed. Something went quiet. And then, for the first time in 3 days, stopped being afraid. Millie woke to the smell of broth. Not the thin, over-salted kind that the Asheville kitchens produced in winter when the stores were running low. This was something richer, bone-deep, with thyme and something smoky underneath, the kind of smell that the body responds to before the mind catches up. Her stomach tightened with a want so immediate it almost embarrassed her. Then she remembered where she was, and her eyes opened. The cabin was warmer than it had any right to be. The fire had been built up considerably since she'd fallen asleep. The logs stacked with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, the flame steady and low and orange gold. The single window was dark. Night then, or the storm still swallowing all available light. The roaring had quieted to a sustained pressure, wind pushing against the walls with a kind of rhythmic insistence that had almost become ordinary. She sat up. He was at the table. She hadn't heard him sit. She hadn't heard anything, which was, she would think later, remarkable for a man his size. He was facing partly away from her, a clay bowl in front of him, a second bowl already set at the opposite side of the table with the kind of deliberateness that suggested it had been placed there on purpose and some time ago. He had removed his outer fur mantle. It hung on the hook beside the door, still shedding melt, but he wore a black leather jerkin crossed with heavy buckled straps, bracers at his forearms, dark trousers tucked into boots that had tracked snow across the stone floor in a path she could follow from the door to where he sat. His hair was black, worn in long braids that fell past his shoulders. The fire caught the edges of them. He had the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm so much as from absolute control. The stillness of something very powerful that has decided for the moment not to move. He hadn't looked at her yet. Or rather, she understood, with the particular instinct she'd developed over years of navigating ranked wolves. He was allowing her to look at him first, giving her that. The time to assess, to orient, to decide whether to bolt for the door. She assessed. He was dominant. She didn't need a wolf of her own to feel that. It came off him in waves, steady and dense like heat from a banked forge. Not aggressive, just present. The kind of dominance that doesn't need to announce itself because everything in the room already knows. The scar. A thin line, pale against the dark stubble at his jaw, running from just below his left cheekbone toward his chin. Old. His eyes, when he finally turned his head to look at her, were the particular blue of deep winter sky, not pale, not soft. Clear and direct, and entirely without performance. He said, "You built the fire." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. His voice was low and even, the kind that doesn't rise and doesn't rush. Millie's first instinct was to apologize. She had lived long enough in Asheville to know that an unranked Omega entering a dominant space uninvited was, at minimum, a serious breach. One that ranked wolves had every right to respond to harshly. The apology sat ready on her tongue. She swallowed it. "The door wasn't barred," she said instead. "The storm was building. I fed the fire and I didn't touch anything else." A pause. He looked at her with the same unhurried attention he might give a page of maps. "You kept it from going out," he said. "The wood I'd left wasn't enough to last the storm. You added from the back stack." She had. She'd found it under a canvas behind the cot. "Yes," she said. Then you're welcome to the broth. He turned back to his bowl with no further ceremony, and Millie sat very still for a moment, trying to determine if she was safe. Every instinct she had, and she had learned to trust them in the absence of a wolf to trust, said that the threat level in this room was not what she'd feared. The man had come in from a blizzard, found a stranger sleeping at his hearth, and set a second bowl out. That was not the behavior of someone who intended harm. She stood, slowly, keeping the blanket around her shoulders, and crossed to the table. The second stool scraped against stone as she pulled it out. She sat. The bowl in front of her was steaming gently. "I'm Millie," she said, because it seemed like the least she could offer. He glanced at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite surprise, but a form of attention. "Xander," he said. No title, no pack name, no rank declaration, which any dominant meeting a stranger for the first time in his own territory would ordinarily offer, partly as courtesy and partly as warning. She filed the absence away without commenting on it. She drank the broth. It was extraordinary, and she hated how much comfort it gave her, because comfort felt dangerous when she didn't yet know where she stood. "You came from the Eastern Territory," he said, after a while. Not a question again. She looked up. "Your boots," he said. "The clay soil under the snow near Ashvale's eastern tree line has a particular rust color. It's on your soles." She looked down. He was right. The dried mud caked into the stitching of her boots was, in the firelight, distinctly reddish. "Yes," she said carefully. "Alone. No escort. In the beginning of a storm that the Ridgehawks were signaling since dawn." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his bowl. "You weren't caught out by the weather. You left knowing it was coming." The accuracy of it landed on her chest like a stone. "Is that your way of asking why?" she said. "It's my way of saying you're not lost." His eyes came up then. "Whatever you're running from, you chose this direction on purpose." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Something she'd learned most unranked wolves couldn't do with a dominant. Something that had always cost her nothing, because she had no submissive wolf inside her to buckle under the weight of rank. "I had documents stolen," she said at last. "Inheritance papers. The deed to my father's estate. A man I was raised alongside has filed a false claim against the land. By the time any local council would hear an appeal, he'll have married the deed into his family line and buried the question entirely." She paused. "I was going to the Iron Vale border outpost." Something moved through his expression. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition, perhaps. "To claim sanctuary," he said. "To reach someone with the authority to hear a case that a pack council won't." The fire shifted, and a log broke apart softly, sending a brief cascade of orange sparks up the throat of the chimney. The wind pushed at the walls. Outside, the blizzard had settled into its long, implacable business. Xander set his spoon down. "Iron Vale's northern outpost is 3 days from here in clear weather," he said. "In this storm, 4, perhaps 5. The passes will be blocked until the wind turns." Millie absorbed this. "How long will the storm last?" 2 days, maybe 3. 2 or 3 days. She looked at the fire. She looked at the stack of wood, rebuilt now to a respectable height. She looked at the single cot against the wall, and the blanket she was still wearing. "I won't be a burden," she said quietly. "I can manage the fire through the night. I know which herbs reduce fever if either of us takes cold. I can cook if there's anything to cook with." She met his eyes again. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a fair trade." He studied her for a long moment. "There are 2 children at the outpost," he said, and the way he said it was careful, weighted. "My brother's sons. I brought them north when Iron Vale's capital became unsafe. They've been in the care of a soldier's widow, but she took fever 3 days ago, and her sister came to take her south for tending. He paused. I went out this morning to ride for the garrison, to bring a guardwoman back to stay with the boys. The storm cut me off. Millie felt the shape of what he was describing settle into place in her mind. How old? She said. 7 and 4. And they're alone at the outpost now, with 2 guards at the gate and a cook who doesn't sleep in the main house. His jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of what that cost him to say. I cannot ride back through this. I tried. The northern pass is a whiteout. A horse would break a leg inside the first quarter mile. The silence between them was full of the things neither of them was saying yet. Millie put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them, reddened from the cold, knuckles still raw, the small burn scar on her left thumb from years of helping the healer with tallow candles. Then she looked at him. Let me stay, she said. When the storm breaks, take me to them. I'll care for the boys until you can make other arrangements. A few days, a week, if needed. She held his gaze. In exchange, I want passage to Iron Vale's seat of judgment. A letter of introduction if you have the authority to write one, and your word that you won't send word back to Ashvale of my whereabouts. His blue eyes didn't waver. You're negotiating, he said. And there was something in his tone, not mockery, not dismissal. Something that sounded very quietly like the beginning of respect. I'm offering a fair arrangement, she said. I have nothing else to offer, so I'm offering what I have. The fire breathed. The storm pressed. Somewhere in the wall, a timber settled with a low groan. Xander picked up his spoon again. The boys' names are Edmund and Pip, he said. Edmund is the elder. He doesn't sleep well. Pip is afraid of the dark, but he won't say so. Millie exhaled, very slowly. I'll remember that, she said. The storm broke on the second morning, the way storms sometimes do. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the sky had simply decided it was finished and moved on to other business. Millie was already awake when the wind stopped. She had slept on the cot, wrapped in the wool blanket, and Xander had taken the floor beside the hearth with his fur mantle, and the particular stillness of a man who had slept in worse places and found no reason to complain about it. She had woken twice in the night to feed the fire, and both times he had been exactly as she'd left him, motionless, breathing slowly, present even in sleep in a way that felt less like vulnerability and more like a choice. She had not let herself think too much about that. Now she laced her boots in the thin gray light coming through the shutter gaps and listened to the silence outside. True silence this time. Not the muffled roar of the blizzard, but the deep, still quiet of a world buried under fresh snow, holding its breath. Xander was already standing at the door when she straightened. "Can the horse manage it?" she asked. "There's only one horse," he said, pulling on his fur mantle. "You'll ride behind." She nearly said she could walk. She stopped herself because it would have been pride talking, and pride was a luxury she had already decided to set aside for the duration of whatever this was. The horse was a dark gray stallion stabled in a lean-to built against the cabin's rear wall. Large, calm, with the kind of patient intelligence that good war horses develop over years of carrying dangerous men into uncertain places. He accepted Millie's hand at his nose without drama. She mounted behind Xander, settled her satchel across her lap, and they moved into the white. The forest had been transformed. Every branch carried its weight of snow with a kind of quiet extravagance, and the light that came through was silver blue and soft, the sort of light that makes everything look like it belongs to a different, slower world. The stallion picked his way with care, and Xander guided him without apparent effort, reading the terrain under the snow the way Millie read the healer's dried herb bundles, by long familiarity and something close to instinct. They didn't speak much. She found she didn't mind. The outpost emerged from the tree line in the early afternoon, a long, low stone building, solidly built, with a watchtower at its northern corner and a gate flanked by 2 guards in iron veil colors, deep gray and iron black, a wolf's head crest on their tabards. They straightened when they saw the horse. They went rigid when they saw who was on it. One of them, young, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone trying very hard to maintain composure, took a step forward and pressed his fist to his chest. "My king," he said. Millie went very still. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She sat behind him on the horse and felt the shape of the last 2 days rearrange itself around this new information with a slowness that was almost dreamlike, as if her mind was insisting on reassembling every detail before it allowed her to react. My king. Xander of Ironvale, the Alphaking. She had negotiated with him over a clay bowl of broth. She had told him to not send word to Ashvale. She had asked him for a letter of introduction, as though he were a minor border official who might or might not have the authority to write one. He swung down from the saddle and turned to help her dismount, and she took his offered hand because refusing it would have been absurd, and her legs were not entirely steady when she reached the ground. He noticed. She could tell by the slight adjustment of his grip, the way he didn't release her hand until she'd found her footing, but he said nothing about it. "The boys?" he said to the guard. "Inside, my king. The cook has them. Edmund has been asking for you since yesterday morning." The guard's eyes moved briefly to Millie, careful and neutral. "Shall I?" "She's a guest," Xander said simply. "See that a room is prepared." Inside, the outpost smelled of pine smoke and beeswax, and the particular warm bread smell of a kitchen fire that had been going all day. The main hall was modest by royal standards. Stone floor, heavy timber ceiling, a long table, iron candle holders, maps pinned to a wooden frame along one wall with small lead weights at their corners. Functional. The home of someone who doesn't spend time in a place for comfort, but who ensures the things that matter are properly maintained. The smaller of the 2 boys found them before they reached the inner hall. He came around the corner at a run, skidded on the stone floor, caught himself on the doorframe, and stared at Xander with the particular expression of a 4-year-old who has been frightened for a long time and is trying very hard to look as though he hasn't been. Pip. He had his uncle's dark hair, but his eyes were brown and wide and currently glistening in the way that precedes tears in children who have decided they are too old to cry. Xander crouched in front of him immediately, which surprised her. The fluid, unself-conscious way he dropped to the child's level, no hesitation, no ceremony. "I'm here," he said, simply, completely. Pip's face crumpled for exactly 1 second before he pulled it back together with a visible effort that was, somehow, the most heartbreaking thing Millie had seen in days. He nodded once, very seriously. Then his gaze moved to Millie. Children looked at her differently than adults did. Adults saw an omega without a wolf and made a series of rapid calculations. Children just looked, open and direct, reading things that adults had long since trained themselves not to notice. "Who is she?" Pip said. "Her name is Millie," Xander said. "She's going to stay for a while." Pip considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. Then, "Can she make porridge?" Millie crouched down to his level without thinking about it. "I can make porridge," she said. "I can also make honey bread, if there's honey in the kitchen." Pip's expression shifted into something cautiously hopeful. Edmund appeared in the doorway behind his brother. 7 years old, taller, with a careful, watchful quality that sat oddly on a child's face. The look of someone who has recently learned that the world is less reliable than he'd been told, and has decided to pay closer attention from now on. He looked at Millie with Xander's kind of assessment. Steady, thorough, revealing nothing until he'd finished. "Are you a healer?" he asked. "I've trained with one," she said honestly. "I'm not a healer myself, but I know a good deal." He nodded once. Apparently that was sufficient. She settled in over the following days with the quiet efficiency that had always been her best survival tool. The room they gave her was small, but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the snow-covered yard and the tree line beyond. She found the kitchen stores and organized them without being asked, identified which herbs the outpost had and which were missing, and began making the meals that the cook, a taciturn older man named Baron, had been struggling to produce for two active children with specific preferences. Edmund liked his food plain and didn't trust sauces. Pip ate almost anything but refused, with impressive stubbornness, to eat anything gray. She learned these things by watching and asking and adjusting, the same way she'd learned everything that mattered. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the boys would adjust to her. By the third morning, Pip was appearing at the kitchen doorway before she'd even started the fire, dragging a woolen blanket and prepared to sit on the floor and watch her work with the focused attention of someone receiving extremely important information. Edmund came later, more formally, and sat at the kitchen table with a small book he pretended to read, while actually tracking her every movement. She didn't comment on it. She just made sure there was always something worth tracking. Xander watched from further away. He was in the outpost, but rarely idle. He spent hours at the map table, received 2 riders over those first days, sent sealed letters back with them. He ate with the boys at the long table in the evenings. He didn't seek her out, but he was never entirely absent from the edges of her awareness. She would turn from the hearth and find him in the doorway, or she would come into the hall and know, before she saw him, that he was already there. It wasn't threatening. That was the thing that confused her. She had spent years calibrating herself against dominant wolves, learning the microsignals of aggression, the shifts in posture that preceded a display, the way ranked males compressed the air in a room when they wanted something they hadn't decided how to ask for yet. She knew those signals the way she knew the smell of rain before it arrived. Xander produced none of them. On the 4th evening, after the boys had been settled, Pip with a candle left burning low on the ledge near his cot, Edmund with the particular rigid stillness of someone determined to prove he could sleep without trouble, she found Xander at the map table alone. She almost retreated. She was aware, constantly, of the renegotiation that needed to happen between them, the one where they both acknowledged that she had not known who he was, and that this changed everything about the terms she'd proposed over broth in a snowbound cabin. "You should have told me," she said from the doorway. He looked up. The candles on the table threw warm light across the maps, across the scar on his jaw. "I know," he said. No justification, no elaborate explanation, just the plain acknowledgement, offered without deflection. She stepped into the room. "My offer still stands," she said. "What I proposed was fair, regardless of your rank. I don't want it reinterpreted as something it wasn't. I wasn't trying to— Millie." Her name in his mouth, even said quietly, had a weight she wasn't prepared for. "I know what you were doing. You were surviving." He held her gaze. "I've sent a rider to the records keeper at Ironvale's seat. If your father registered the deed with the Kingdom's Central Archive at any point, and most Ashvale landholders did for tax purposes, there will be a copy." She stopped breathing for a moment. "That could take weeks to verify," she managed. "Yes," he said. "So the arrangement you proposed, your words, still stands. You stay, in exchange for passage and a letter of introduction, once we have something worth introducing you with." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, at the maps spread under his hands, at the quiet authority with which he occupied the room, and the complete absence of any indication that he found her ridiculous for having negotiated with a king over a bowl of bone broth. "Edmund had a nightmare last night," she said finally. "He didn't call out, but I heard him. He was trying to manage it alone." Something shifted in Xander's expression, not surprise. Something closer to pain, pressed down and held still. "He does that," he said quietly. "I know." She paused at the door. "I thought you should." She left him there, at the map table in the candlelight, with the knowledge of his nephew's loneliness and the particular stillness of a man who was learning something he wished he hadn't had to be told. The rider returned from Ironvale's seat on a Tuesday, 12 days after Xander had sent him. Millie was in the yard when the horse came through the gate. She had taken to walking the perimeter each morning, partly for the cold air, and partly because movement helped her think, and there was a great deal she needed to think about. She heard the hoofbeats and turned, and she watched Xander come out of the main building and take the sealed document from the rider's hand, with the calm of a man who has learned not to let expectation show on his face before he knows what he's holding. He broke the seal. Read. Then he looked up and found her eyes across the yard, and something in his expression told her everything before he said a word. She walked toward him. Her boots crunched through the snow crust. The cold was sharp and clear, the kind that makes the inside of your nose ache and turns every exhaled breath into a small white cloud. He held the document out to her. She read it standing in the yard, in the winter light, with her fingers going numb against the parchment. Her father, Lord Edwin of Ashvale, registered landholder under Ironvale's Eastern Territorial Charter, had indeed filed copies of the primary estate documents with the kingdom's central archive 7 years before his death. The deed, the lineage papers, the inheritance designation, written in his own hand and witnessed by 2 members of the regional council, naming his daughter Millicent as sole heir to Ashvale's eastern holdings. And one additional document she hadn't known existed, a letter, also filed with the archive, written in the last months of her father's illness, in which he stated clearly that Corvin of the secondary Ashvale line was granted no claim to the primary estate under any circumstances, and that any attempt to contest this inheritance through pack council should be referred immediately to Ironvale's seat of judgment. Her father had known. He had known what Corvin might attempt, and he had quietly built a wall around her before he died, in the only language that would hold. Kingdom law, archived beyond any pack's reach. She had not known. He had not told her. She had spent 11 years in that house, managing, surviving, calibrating herself against Corvin's growing confidence, and all along her father had left her a locked door and simply not given her the key. She didn't know whether to feel protected or furious or devastated. She felt all 3 in rapid succession, standing in the snow with the parchment shaking slightly in her hands. "Millie," Xander's voice. She looked up. "Come inside," he said, with the same tone he used with the boys when they'd pushed past the point where being outside was doing them any good. She followed him in. He put her in the chair nearest the hall fire and brought her a cup of something hot. Not broth this time, but a spiced tea that Baron apparently knew how to make and produced only on significant occasions, judging by the way he disappeared tactfully into the kitchen after setting it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the fire, and let the information settle. "He'll contest it," she said after a while. "Corvin, when the archive ruling is issued, he'll claim the copies are fraudulent, or that my father was not of sound mind. He'll find something." "He can try," Xander said. He was sitting across from her, elbows on his knees, giving her his full attention in the unhurried way she'd come to recognize as simply how he listened. "An archive filing witnessed by council members and cross-referenced with the estate's tax records is not easily dismissed. And the letter of intention your father included is explicit. Corvin would be challenging a dead lord's written word against a kingdom archive." He paused. "That is a challenge he will lose." "He won't accept losing quietly." "No," Xander agreed. "He won't." She appreciated that he didn't soften it. "What he will do," Xander continued, "is move quickly, before the ruling can be officially delivered to Ashvale Pack. If he knows a rider came here, he may already suspect the archive has been contacted. He'll try to consolidate what he can before the legal ground disappears under him." His jaw tightened slightly. Which means the people loyal to your father, any servants, any pack members who knew him, may be in a difficult position in the coming weeks. Millie set down the cup. There's a woman, she said. Nora. She was my father's head of household for 20 years. She knew where everything was. She helped him, probably. She might have known about the archive filing. A cold certainty was settling in her chest. If Corvin suspects she helped him, or that she'd testify to what she knew. I'll send a writer to Asheville, Xander said, with a royal summons. Any individual named in connection with a Kingdom Archive case can be called to Ironvale's seat as a witness. It gives them legal standing to leave, and it gives Corvin no grounds to detain them. He looked at her steadily. Is there anyone else? She thought of the healer, of old Petter, who had managed the estate stables since before she was born. Of the 2 kitchen girls who had been kind to her and careful around Corvin in the particular way that people are careful around things that might bite. She gave him the names, all of them. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he called one of the guards and gave quiet, precise instructions that she heard clearly and understood were already setting something in motion that Corvin, back in Asheville, could not yet see coming. That was the day she understood the difference. She had spent years watching Corvin manage the world through pressure and small cruelties and the strategic withholding of things people needed. He built his position by making others smaller. Every favor he granted was a debt he intended to collect. Every kindness was a tool. Xander used authority the way a skilled healer used a blade, precisely, only where necessary, with the intention of fixing something rather than simply demonstrating that he could cut. The distinction settled into her bones and stayed there. Over the following days, the outpost took on the quality of something almost ordinary. Edmund began appearing at the map table in the evenings, sitting quietly with a piece of parchment and a stick of charcoal, drawing his own maps of territories he invented with the serious creative energy of a child who has decided that cartography is a suitable occupation. Xander would correct the geography occasionally, not critically, just noting where the mountain ranges actually sat, and Edmund would absorb the correction without embarrassment and adjust. Pip had decided that Millie was his person. This had been announced, not requested. One morning when she was plaiting her hair, and he had climbed onto the bed beside her and stated it as simple fact. You're my person now. She had not known what to say, so she had said, all right. And he had nodded with satisfaction and slid off the bed to go find his breakfast. She let herself feel the weight of that, the strange, fragile warmth of being chosen by a 4-year-old with brown eyes and his uncle's stubborn self-possession, and tried not to think about what it would mean to leave. But she would leave. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. She reminded herself of this on a particularly still evening when Xander came into the kitchen while she was sorting the herb stores and stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. The formal ruling will be issued within the fortnight, he said. Once it's delivered to Asheville and to the regional council, you'll be able to return, with a royal escort, if you want one. She kept her hands moving through the dried bundles. Chamomile, rosemary, the papery silver-gray leaves of winter sage. Will Corvin be removed from the estate? She said. He'll be ordered to vacate and to surrender any documents he took. If he fails to comply, the order becomes enforceable by the kingdom's guard. He paused. You'll have your home back, Millie. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief. But it was layered over something else, something she didn't entirely want to look at directly. And if I don't want to go back? She said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived the way honest things sometimes do, bypassing all the careful management she'd trained herself to maintain. The silence in the kitchen was complete for a moment, filled only with the small sound of the fire and the distant voices of the boys somewhere in the main hall. She turned to face him. He was watching her with the full steadiness of his attention, which was, she had learned, something he did not give carelessly or often. "Then you don't go back," he said. "That's not—" She stopped. "The arrangement was specific. I stay, I help with the boys, in exchange for passage and legal support. I've received the legal support. I've stayed longer than the original agreement required." She pressed her hands flat against the work table. "I'm not trying to renegotiate something that wasn't— Millie." Again, her name in his voice, with that quiet weight. "I'm not holding you to a contract." "Then what are you holding me to?" He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, not rushing, not hesitating, and stopped close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze. Close enough that she could smell cold air and pine resin and leather, and beneath all of it something warmer, something that the part of her without a wolf couldn't name, but that every other part of her had been quietly cataloging for 12 days. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not holding you to anything." He searched her face with the same unhurried care he gave to maps and to his nephew's silences and to the decisions he made at the table where the future of a kingdom got arranged. "I'm telling you that you have a choice, a real one. Possibly for the first time." She had no answer to that. He didn't wait for one. He stepped back, giving her space without retreating entirely. "Corvin's rider was stopped at the Eastern Pass this morning," he said, returning to a steadier register. "He was carrying a forged document, a revised version of the deed with your name removed. My border guards have him. He'll be brought to Iron Vale's seat as evidence." The line of his jaw was set and clean. Corvin made his move. He's exposed himself. The warmth that had been tentatively building in her chest rearranged itself into something colder and clearer. "I want to be there," she said, "when the ruling is delivered, when he's made to answer for it." She held Xander's gaze. "I want to stand in that room." He nodded once. "Then you'll stand in that room," he said, as if it had never been a question, as if her right to be present at the moment of her own justice was so obvious it required no debate. She turned back to the herbs before he could see her face. She heard him leave. She heard his boots on the stone corridor, the particular rhythm of them, steady, even, unhurried. She pressed both hands flat on the work table and breathed. Outside, in the hall, Pip's voice rose in a complaint about Edmund taking the better candle, and Edmund's voice responded with calm, infuriating logic. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she heard Xander's low voice settle the dispute with 3 words she couldn't make out. Followed by silence. Followed by the sound of both boys apparently accepting the verdict without further argument. She closed her eyes. "This is not yours," she told herself. But the feeling didn't listen. Iron Vale's seat of judgment was everything Ashvale was not. Where Ashvale's great hall had been built to impress through accumulated darkness, heavy tapestries, low ceilings, torchlight designed to make the Alpha at the head of the table look larger than everything else. Iron Vale's judgment chamber was built for clarity. High stone walls, tall windows that let in the full gray light of a winter afternoon. A raised platform at the far end where the kingdom's chief record-keeper stood beside a reading table, and in front of it, 2 long benches for witnesses and council members, and an open floor where those being judged were required to stand without the comfort of a seat or a wall behind them. Corvin looked smaller here than he ever had at Ashvale. Millie noticed that first, before the formal proceedings began, before the record-keeper called the session to order, before Corvin's gaze found her across the chamber and went very still. He looked smaller. The confidence that had always occupied the space around him like a second body had contracted, pressed inward by the weight of a room that was not his, before a authority that owed him nothing. She stood to the left of the chamber, behind the witness rail, in a gown that one of the household women at Iron Vale's garrison had lent her. Deep blue wool, simply cut, with a belt of brown leather at her waist. Her blonde hair was braided back, as always. She had asked for nothing elaborate. She had only asked to look like herself. Xander stood at the front of the chamber, to the right of the platform, in the dark formal attire of his rank, black tunic beneath a charcoal wool mantle edged in iron-gray fur, the wolf-head crest of iron veil at his shoulder. He did not look at Corvin with anger. He looked at him with the particular quality of attention a man gives to something he has already assessed and found wanting, and has now simply come to conclude. The proceedings were not long. Kingdom law, unlike pack politics, did not leave much room for the kind of maneuvering that Corvin had built his life around. The archive copies of her father's documents were presented and verified by the record keeper. The forged deed, the one Corvin's rider had been carrying when the border guards stopped him, was presented alongside it. The rider himself testified briefly, under oath to the moon and the kingdom's seal, confirming who had given him the document and what he had been instructed to do with it. Corvin attempted twice to reframe the narrative. The first time, he suggested the archive copies might have been filed in error, that her father's intentions had been verbally revised before his death. The record keeper responded by reading aloud the letter of intention, the one her father had written in the last months of his illness, in which he had anticipated exactly this argument and addressed it with a precision that made the chamber go very quiet. The second time, Corvin looked directly at Millie and said, with the practiced reasonableness she had watched him deploy her entire life, that surely a private arrangement could be reached, that surely there was no need for this level of formality between family. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not soften. She did not offer him the exit that his eyes were asking for. He had called her wolfless. He had called her inadequate. He had stood in a room she was not supposed to know about and calculated how quickly she would disappear into a ditch, and he had been wrong about all of it, and she let him see, very clearly, that she knew it. The ruling was issued within the hour. Corvin was ordered to vacate the Ashvale estate within 14 days and to surrender all documentation he had removed from the records room. A formal notation of fraudulent intent was entered into the kingdom's register under his name, a mark that would follow him to every pack council and every land transaction he attempted for the rest of his life. He was not imprisoned. Kingdom law reserved that for violence, not forgery in land disputes. But he was finished. Every door that his father's name had opened would close, one by one, as the notation spread through the channels that ranked wolves used to determine who was trustworthy. He knew it. She watched him understand it, there in the chamber, in the gray winter light. He left without speaking to her again. Nora was already at Iron Vale's garrison when Millie came out of the judgment chamber, brought by the royal rider Xander had sent, along with old Petter and the 2 kitchen girls, all of them housed in the garrison's guest quarters and apparently being fed extremely well by Iron Vale's kitchen staff, judging by Petter's expression when she found him. Nora wept when she saw Millie, briefly and without apology, and then straightened and took both Millie's hands and said, "Your father would have been so angry that it came to this, and so proud of how you handled it." And Millie had to press her lips together very hard for a moment and look at the ceiling. "He knew," Millie said when she trusted her voice. "About Corvin. He filed everything." "Of course he knew," Nora said, with the mild exasperation of someone confirming information she'd considered obvious for years. "He told me, the winter before he died. He said you were stronger than anyone had given you credit for, and that when the time came, the law would say so clearly." She squeezed Millie's hands. He was right. Millie thought about her father, his quietness, his sadness after her wolf failed to surface, the way he'd looked at her differently from then on. She had always read that difference as disappointment. She understood now, standing in a garrison corridor in Iron Vale with Nora's warm hands around hers, that she had been wrong. It hadn't been disappointment. It had been worry. The particular helpless worry of a parent who can see the shape of the world his child will have to navigate, and knows he won't always be there to stand beside her. He had done what he could. He had built the wall before he left. She let herself feel that, fully, without managing it, for the first time. She found Xander in the garrison's library that evening. It was a proper library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, The smell of old parchment and beeswax candles, and the faint sweetness of cedar used to protect the older volumes from damp. Edmund would have loved it. She made a mental note to bring him here before they left. Xander was standing at a tall window, looking out at the courtyard below, where the last of the day's light was turning the snow amber. He heard her come in. She knew he had, because nothing about him didn't notice things. But he waited until she crossed the room and stood beside him before he spoke. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked out at the courtyard. 2 guards were crossing it below, their breath rising in the cold. A torch flared at the gate. "I owe you more than I can repay," she said. "You don't owe me anything." His voice was low and even. "I told you, this wasn't a debt." "Then what was it?" He turned from the window to look at her. In the candlelight of the library, his eyes were very blue and very direct, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, as if she were worth the full weight of his attention, and as if he had decided this a long time ago and had no intention of revising it. "You walked into a blizzard alone," he said, "with nothing but a gray cloak and enough intelligence to find shelter and enough courage to negotiate from a position of nothing." A pause. "You kept my fire from going out. You learned my nephew's nightmares and their preferences and their silences. And you treated all of it with more care than most people who've known them their whole lives." He held her gaze. "I didn't help you because you owed me something. I helped you because you deserved to have someone help you. And because—" He stopped. She waited. "Because my wolf knew what you were to me," he said quietly. "From the moment I came through that door and found you sleeping at my hearth." The library was very still. She had known, somewhere below the careful management of the past weeks, that this was the shape of it. She had felt it in the way his presence registered in a room before she saw him. She had felt it in the way the space between them had its own specific weight. She had not let herself name it, because the last time she had trusted the direction, something was pulling her. She had been standing in an empty records room staring at a bare shelf. "I don't have a wolf," she said. "I've never felt a bond. I don't know if I—" "I know," he said. "And it doesn't matter." He said it without hesitation, without qualification. "The bond is there or it isn't, and it has nothing to do with whether your wolf surfaced. You are not less because of that. You never were." She pressed her lips together. She looked at the window. "Pip told me this morning that I'm not allowed to leave," she said after a moment. "He was very clear about it. He said Edmund agrees, but that Edmund won't say so himself." Something moved through Xander's expression, that rare, unguarded thing that appeared only at the edges of his face when he wasn't pressing it back. "Edmund does agree," he said. "He told me last night." She turned to look at him fully. "I'm not the same person I was when I walked into your cabin," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't want to be managed or protected into smallness. I want to go back to Asheville and restore what my father built and make it worth something again. I want Nora to have her position back. I want Peter to have the stables. I want the girls from the kitchen to be paid properly. Then that's what will happen. And I don't want to be someone's omega." She held his gaze. "I don't know what I am without a wolf, but I know I'm not nothing, and I won't be treated as nothing." "You won't be," he said. Simply, completely. The same 2 words he'd given Pip in the snow, and they carried the same absolute quality. Not a promise decorated with conditions, just a fact stated plainly, by a man who understood the difference between the 2. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, just placed her fingers over his, where his hand rested on the window ledge, and left them there. He turned his hand and held hers, and they stood at the window in the candlelight, while the last of the amber faded from the snow outside, and the courtyard torches came up one by one in the dark. They married in the spring, in the garrison courtyard, under an open sky. It was not a grand ceremony. Millie had not wanted grand. She had wanted real, and real turned out to be a courtyard with torches and early apple blossom from the single tree that grew in the garrison's inner garden, and Nora weeping again at the back, and Peter standing very straight in a new coat that someone had quietly arranged for him, and Edmund watching the proceedings with the expression of someone conducting a final quality assessment and finding it satisfactory, and Pip falling asleep standing up against Edmund's shoulder halfway through, and being carried inside by one of the guards, without ever fully waking. Xander had said the night before that she could have whatever ceremony she wanted, in whatever place she chose. She had said she wanted the garrison courtyard, because it was where she'd come out of the judgment chamber and into the cold air and understood, for the first time, that she was free. He had said nothing. He had just looked at her with the full weight of his blue eyes, and nodded once. The Ashvale estate was restored before midsummer. Corvin left without resistance. The kingdom's notation had done its work, and there was nothing left for him to hold. Nora returned to the house and opened every window. Petter returned to the stables. The 2 kitchen girls received positions with proper wages, recorded and enforced under Iron Vale's Eastern Charter. Millie returned twice in that first year, once to see the restoration through, and once to stand in her father's study and sit at his desk and read for the first time the copy of his letter of intention that the archive had returned to her. His handwriting, his words, his careful, quiet love, archived 7 years before she'd needed it, waiting in the dark for exactly the moment it would matter most. She folded it and put it in the cedar box she kept on the shelf above her bed at the garrison. Edmund grew into someone steady and serious, and occasionally surprising, with a dry wit that emerged in unexpected moments, and a gift for strategy that Xander began, carefully, to teach. Pip grew into someone loud and warm, and absolutely certain of his place in the world. A certainty he appeared to have decided was permanent on the morning he'd climbed onto a bed and announced that Millie was his person. He had been right. She was. And she was also, it turned out, exactly enough, without a wolf, without a rank, without anything except the gray cloak and the refusal to disappear, and the fire she had built in a stranger's hearth during a blizzard, which had kept them all warm long enough for the storm to end.